Most people think of toxic individuals as merely negative or annoying, but if you want to free yourself from the effects of these individuals permanently, you have to go deeper. You have to understand what's actually happening inside your brain and nervous system when you're exposed to toxic behavior. Because toxic people aren't just unpleasant, they're neurologically contagious. Let's break this down. When someone around you expresses anger, judgment, passive aggression, or manipulation, your brain registers these signals as threats, even if they're subtle. This happens automatically and often below your conscious awareness. The key region involved here is the amygdala, a small but powerful part of your limbic system responsible for threat detection and emotional memory. The amygdala doesn't care whether the threat is physical or emotional, it just responds fast. Before you even realize now, once the amygdala detects this interpersonal threat, it sends signals to other parts of your brain and body, activating the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis, which governs your stress response. Cortisol levels rise, your heart rate increases, blood flows redirected from your prefrontal cortex, the center of logic and executive function, toward your survival systems. This impairs your ability to think clearly, make strategic decisions, and regulate your emotions. That's why after dealing with toxic people, you often feel foggy, drained, or irritated even hours later. This isn't psychological weakness. It's a predictable, measurable neurological cascade. What makes this worse is the phenomenon of emotional contagion, a process driven largely by mirror neurons. These are specialized neurons that fire both when you experience an emotion and when you observe someone else experiencing it. This is the basis of empathy, but in the presence of toxic individuals, it becomes a liability. If someone is displaying hostility, despair, or manipulation, your brain begins to echo those same emotional states internally. Without deliberate regulation, you absorb their state like secondhand smoke for the brain. This is why toxicity spreads. It's not just that toxic people say negative things. Their presence changes your neurochemical state. Your brain literally begins to behave differently in their proximity. And over time, repeated exposure reinforces these neural patterns. You start expecting stress. You become hypervigilant. Your baseline emotional state shifts to one of alertness or anxiety even when the toxic person isn't present. That's how chronic exposure creates long-term dysregulation of your nervous system. The tragedy is that many people don't realize this is happening. They personalize the experience. Why can't I handle this better? Or maybe I'm too sensitive, but what's really happening is that their neurobiology is adapting to a toxic environment in the only way it knows how, by activating defense mechanisms. And those mechanisms are costly. They sap your energy, they impair sleep, they disrupt focus. Over time, they can even lead to symptoms of burnout, depression, or anxiety disorders. What's important to realize here is that your nervous system is not the problem. It's responding exactly the way it's designed to. The problem is that most people are never taught how to recognize these subtle, insidious forms of social stress and, more importantly, how to interrupt their impact. You're not overreacting, you're responding, you're not weak, you're not wired for nervous system survival. And toxic people are triggering that survival wiring over and over again. Understanding this is the first step. When you can see toxic behavior as a neural trigger, not a personal attack, it changes your entire response. You begin to observe instead of absorb. You start creating space instead of shrinking in fear or frustration. You recognize that you're not just having a bad conversation, you're undergoing a full-body stress event. And with that awareness, you can start building the skills to counteract it. Toxicity then is not just a personality flaw in others. It's a biological disturbance that hijacks your nervous system. But once you understand the mechanism, you can start to change the way your brain and body respond. And that's where real freedom begins. Most people think of boundaries as something external, lines you draw in relationships, rules, nervous system, survival, and toxic people are triggering that survival wiring over and over again. Understanding this is the first step. When you can see toxic behavior as a neural trigger, not a personal attack, it changes your entire response. You begin to observe instead of absorb. You start creating space instead of shrinking in fear or frustration. You recognize that you're not just having a bad conversation, you're undergoing a full-body stress event. And with that awareness, you can start building the skills to counteract it. Toxicity then is not just a personality flaw in others. It's a biological disturbance that hijacks your nervous system. But once you understand the mechanism, you can start to change the way your brain and body respond. And that's where real freedom begins. Most people think of boundaries as something external, lines you draw in relationships, rules, nervous system, survival, and toxic people are triggering that survival wiring over and over again. Understanding this is the first step. When you can see toxic behavior as a neural trigger, not a personal attack, it changes your entire response. You begin to observe instead of absorb. You start creating space instead of shrinking in fear or frustration. You recognize that you're not just having a bad conversation, you're undergoing a full body stress event. And with that awareness, you can start building the skills to counteract it. Toxicity then is not just a personality flaw in others. It's a biological disturbance that hijacks your nervous system. But once you understand the mechanism, you can start to change the way your brain and body respond. And that's where real freedom begins. Most people think of boundaries as something external, lines you draw in relationships, rules, nervous system. You state out loud, or physical separation from others. But long before any external boundary can be respected, there has to be an internal one, a neurological boundary, because your brain is constantly filtering information. And if you don't learn to control that filter, toxic inputs will bypass your awareness and begin shaping your inner state before you even notice it's happening. Your brain's attentional systems centered in the prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, and basal ganglia determine what gets your focus and what gets ignored. These systems evolved to prioritize survival-relevant data. That means threats, novelty, social cues, and emotionally charged content get high priority. Toxic people often exploit this wiring intentionally or not. Their behavior, whether it's passive aggression, manipulation, criticism, or inconsistency, activates these attentional systems, pulling your cognitive resources into their gravitational field. So what happens? You find yourself thinking about them even when they're not around, replaying conversations, anticipating the next encounter. And all of this is happening because your neurological filter has tagged them as important. Not because you care about them in a meaningful way, but because your brain is trying to predict and manage perceived threat. This is not a conscious decision. It's a subcortical prioritization algorithm that evolved for jungle survival and now runs in modern, emotionally complex environments. To reclaim control, you have to rewire that filter consciously and repeatedly. This is not a one-time decision, it's a neuroplastic process. And like all neuroplastic changes, it requires consistency, novelty, and attention. The first step is to stop reacting and start observing. When someone says something that triggers you, notice the physiological response: tight chest, elevated heart rate, mental spinning. Label it. That act of labeling engages the prefrontal cortex, which begins to downregulate the amygdala. That simple cognitive step is the beginning of installing a new boundary. Next comes redirection. Your attentional systems are a lot like a camera. Whatever you point them at becomes your reality. If you constantly focus on the toxic person, what they're doing, how they make you feel, whether you should respond, you are reinforcing a neural network that tells your brain this person is important. Instead, redirect that attention to something goal-directed: work, movement, reading, planning, anything that carries long-term value. This trains the dorsal attention network in your brain to shift out of emotional reactivity and into top-down executive function. Another essential piece is using behavioral gating to interrupt the feedback loop. That means limiting not just emotionally, but neurologically the frequency and intensity of interaction with toxic individuals. This isn't avoidance. This is resource conservation. Every interaction with someone toxic costs you cognitive bandwidth. If you had a limited battery and you wouldn't leave a power-draining app running in the background all day. The same principle applies neurologically. You can also enhance your filtering system by engaging in practices that strengthen prefrontal cortex control. These include focused meditation, cold exposure, controlled breathing, and non-sleep deep rest, Nistra. Each of these trains your brain to resist impulsive reactivity and to modulate emotional arousal, both of which are critical in maintaining internal boundaries when toxic people try to override them. It's also important to use language as a neurological tool. Internal self-talk has a direct effect on the default mode network, the system responsible for self-referential thought and emotional tone. If you constantly tell yourself, this person is driving me crazy, your brain encodes that as truth. If you shift to, this person is not my priority, you're sending a different signal, one that begins to shape how the brain processes their input. Over time, these small shifts accumulate. The attentional filter begins to change. The emotional charge around the toxic person starts to drop. Your reactivity diminishes. You begin to notice space, cognitive space, emotional space where before there was only tension. This is the development of neurological boundaries, your brain learning through repetition and intentional redirection to gate what gets in and what stays out. And it is one of the most powerful forms of personal freedom available. Detachment is often misunderstood. Most people interpret it as apathy, indifference, or emotional coldness. But from a biological standpoint, detachment is not the absence of feeling, it's the presence of autonomic control. It's the ability to regulate your internal state independently of external chaos. And when it comes to toxic people, that skill is not just useful, it's a biological necessity. Every time you engage with a toxic individual, there's a measurable physiological cost. Your nervous system interprets unpredictability, manipulation, and emotional volatility as threats. The sympathetic nervous system, responsible for your fight or flight response, gets activated, heart rate increases, cortisol floods your bloodstream, and your decision-making circuitry, the prefrontal cortex, goes offline. You become reactive instead of reflective, defensive instead of deliberate. Biological detachment begins by reversing that cascade. The process starts in the vagus nerve, the central conduit of the parasympathetic nervous system. It influences heart rate, digestion, respiration, and mood regulation, strengthening vagal tone. The vagus nerve's ability to rapidly activate a calm, grounded state is one of the most effective ways to achieve detachment at the physiological level. When your vagal tone is high, your nervous system becomes resilient. You can remain calm in the presence of stress. You can listen without absorbing. You can observe without internalizing. Practices that enhance vagal tone include slow nasal breathing, cold exposure, humming, chanting, and non-sleep deep rest and stroke protocols. These aren't hacks, they're training tools. Every time you calm your system intentionally, you're telling your brain and body, I'm in control, not them. Over time, this message becomes encoded in your neurology. The presence of a toxic person no longer hijacks your system. It registers as background noise rather than a biological alarm. Detachment also involves a shift in cognitive framing. Most people are wired for social reciprocity. They expect fairness, consistency, and mutual respect. When a toxic person violates those rules, the brain treats it as a prediction error. It keeps cycling through the event, trying to make sense of it. This is how people get stuck. Rumination becomes a loop. But biological detachment means breaking that loop at the level of thought. This requires executive override, a process by which the prefrontal cortex asserts control over limbic activity. Techniques like cognitive labeling, naming the emotional state you're experiencing in real time, can activate this override. For example, telling yourself this is frustration or this is resentment triggers neural activity in the prefrontal cortex, which begins to downregulate the emotional brain. You can't detach from something you haven't labeled. Labeling brings structure to emotion, and structure is the foundation of control. Another element of biological detachment is visual attentional training. Toxic individuals often demand eye contact, emotional engagement, or nonverbal responses. Redirecting your visual attention either by defocusing your gaze, looking slightly away, or grounding your vision on a stable object disrupts the intensity of the connection. This sends signals to your brain that the interaction is non-threatening. You're reducing emotional load through visual disengagement, which is a low intuit pathway. On a deeper level, detachment is about reclaiming the autonomy of your internal state. Every human brain is equipped with a default mode network, a system that governs introspection, identity, and narrative. Toxic individuals often hijack the system by inserting themselves into your mental narrative. You replay what they said. You imagine what they'll say next. You construct arguments in your head. Detachment means choosing not to grant them that space. It means anchoring your narrative to goals, values, and behaviors that serve your growth, not their dysfunction. Importantly, this isn't a one-time decision. It's a physiological discipline. You don't detach once. You train for it. Every regulated breath, every cognitive read, every act of disengagement from unnecessary emotional entanglement strengthens the neural circuits associated with autonomy. Eventually, your body learns to respond to toxicity with neutrality, not apathy, not passive tolerance, just a clean neurological boundary where their chaos can't penetrate your physiology. Emotional regulation is not about suppressing how you feel. It's not about pretending to be calm or forcing positivity in the face of frustration. From a neuroscience perspective, emotional regulation is the process by which the brain and body interpret, respond to, and recover from emotionally charged stimuli. And when you're around toxic individuals, people who provoke, manipulate, guilt trip, or destabilize your mental state, this skill becomes the line between control and collapse. To understand emotional regulation, you have to look at the interaction between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. The limbic system, especially the amygdala, is designed to react. It detects threats and initiates rapid responses. These can be physical or social threats your brain treats both as significant. A passive-aggressive comment, an eye roll, a silent treatment, or guilt-laden statements can all activate this system. The brain's response is automatic. Cortisol and adrenaline surge. Heart rate elevates, focus narrows, you begin to experience tunnel vision and emotional flooding. This is where the prefrontal cortex is supposed to step in. It evaluates context, applies logic, and governs your behavior. But under stress, especially repeated exposure to emotionally dysregulating people, the prefrontal cortex becomes hypoactive. This is not a lack of willpower. It's a physiological shift in resource allocation. Blood flow is redirected toward survival systems. Your capacity for clear decision-making gets compromised. This is why, after difficult interactions, you might say or do things you later regret or feel mentally exhausted without understanding why. The goal of emotional regulation is to reverse this imbalance. One of the most effective ways to train emotional regulation is by building interoceptive awareness, the ability to sense your internal physiological state. This involves becoming aware of subtle signals like increased heart rate, shallow breathing, or muscular tension. These are precursors to emotional escalation. By noticing them early, you create a window where regulation is possible. You don't have to wait until you're overwhelmed. You can intervene in real time. Breathwork is one of the most direct tools for this. Slow, controlled nasal breathing, particularly exhalase breathing, for example, a 4-second inhale and a 6 to 8-second exhale, activates the parasympathetic nervous system. This brings down heart rate, reduces cortisol, and restores prefrontal cortex function. You're not just calming down, you're shifting the entire neurochemical state of your body to regain cognitive control. Another tool is cognitive reappraisal, a process that trains the brain to reinterpret events or statements in a way that reduces emotional impact. For example, instead of interpreting a toxic person's sarcasm as a personal attack, you might reframe it as insecurity on their part. This isn't about excusing behavior, it's about protecting your nervous system from unnecessary activation. When you change the meaning of an input, the brain changes its emotional response. This technique strengthens top-down control and creates measurable changes in neural circuitry. Training emotional regulation also involves exposure to manageable stressors. Cold exposure, physical exercise, high-intensity interval training, and breath holds are all methods that challenge the nervous system in controlled settings. When you condition your body to remain calm under physical discomfort, those same regulatory circuits become more available. Under social or emotional discomfort, it's like building a buffer. You're increasing your capacity to remain grounded even when provoked. Journaling is another effective regulatory tool, not because it's expressive, but because it enhances metacognition, the ability to think about your thinking. When you put emotional experiences into structured language, you recruit areas of the prefrontal cortex involved in sequencing and narrative construction. This reduces amygdala activation and gives you distance from the emotion itself. Writing about an incident with a toxic person can shift your brain's stance from reactive to reflective. Sleep, too, is non-negotiable. Emotional regulation is dramatically impaired when the brain is sleep-deprived. During deep sleep and REM sleep, the brain recalibrates emotional circuits, consolidates memories, and clears stress-related neurochemicals. A single night of poor sleep amplifies amygdala reactivity by up to 60%. So if you're regularly dealing with difficult people, sleep becomes not just recovery, it's your primary defense mechanism. Ultimately, emotional regulation is not about becoming stoic or shutting down your emotions. It's about mastering your nervous system's response to stress in a way that keeps your cognitive resources online and your behavior aligned with your values, no matter who's trying to pull you out of that state. Most people talk about energy as if it's emotional or spiritual, something abstract based on mood or personality. But in neuroscience, energy is measurable, it's biological, and more importantly, it's limited. Your brain and body operate on a fixed supply of neural energy each day. Every decision, thought, emotional reaction, and social interaction draws from that supply. And when it comes to dealing with toxic individuals, that cost rises exponentially. Let's define what neural energy actually is. Every time a neuron fires, it consumes adenosine triphosphate, ATP, the cellular fuel source. Your brain, while accounting for only about 2% of your body mass, consumes over 20% of your 20%. That energy is distributed across various systems: sensory processing, attention, memory consolidation, emotional regulation, executive function. You don't have unlimited fuel for all of it, which means every moment you spend engaging with unnecessary stress, drama, or conflict is energy taken away from goal-directed action. This is especially critical when you understand how attention works. The attentional control network, which includes the prefrontal cortex, posterior parietal cortex, and anterior cingulate cortex, governs what you focus on and how long you stay focused. This system burns neural fuel quickly when you're interrupted, emotionally triggered, or pulled into reactive. Thinking by someone toxic, your attentional system gets hijacked. The result is a spike in cognitive load, a rapid depletion of energy, and often reduced performance in other areas of your life. The brain doesn't distinguish between important and unimportant when allocating energy. It only distinguishes stimulus intensity. If a toxic person enters a room and creates tension, your brain doesn't wait to see if it's worth your energy. It begins deploying resources automatically. Stress hormones elevate, your working memory gets compromised, and your ability to access higher order reasoning diminishes. This means even brief exposures to conflict or manipulation consume a disproportionately large portion of your daily neural budget. Cognitive fatigue is not just feeling tired, it's a neurochemical and structural shift. With ongoing energy drain, the prefrontal cortex shows decreased activation while limbic system structures, like the amygdala, become more dominant. This creates a state of emotional reactivity, impulsive decision-making, and poor boundary enforcement, all of which feed the cycle of toxic interaction. The more energy you lose, the less capable you become of stopping the drain. This is why understanding energy as a finite neural resource is critical. It creates urgency around strategic conservation. Just like a professional athlete doesn't waste energy before a performance, high-functioning individuals who want control over their time, focus, and well-being must become selective about where their cognitive fuel goes. Not everyone deserves access to your mind. Not every conversation is worth the burn rate. Preservation begins with awareness. By tracking what and who consistently drains you, you start to identify high-cost inputs. It might be a coworker who constantly complains, a family member who guilt trips, or a friend who subtly undermines your progress. These interactions don't just waste time, they erode the very systems in your brain responsible for creative thought, discipline, and long-term planning. Neurologically, energy conservation means regulating dopaminergic spikes. Every time you engage with drama, especially if it's emotionally charged, dopamine is released. While dopamine is generally linked to motivation, when released in high volumes through conflict or unpredictability, it leads to post-spike crashes. You experience temporary engagement followed by emotional and physical depletion. This is how toxic individuals create cycles of stimulation and exhaustion without providing any real value. Another aspect to consider is decision fatigue. Every micro decision, how to respond to someone's sarcasm, whether to engage in another argument, how to avoid confrontation, consumes energy. The more decisions you're forced to make in managing a toxic person, the less capacity you have for critical life choices. Over time, this erosion of decision-making power can lead to stagnation, burnout, or even self-sabotage. The nervous system is plastic but not inexhaustible. Recovery from energy depletion requires high-quality sleep, controlled stress exposure, deep rest protocols, and nutrient-dense fueling. But the first line of defense is behavioral, reducing your exposure to energy-draining stimuli before your biology is forced to recover from them. Once you start thinking of energy not as a personality trait, but as a biological currency, your decision-making changes. You begin to ask not how do I feel about this person, but what does this person cost me neurologically? The human nervous system was never designed for a life of constant comfort. It evolved under pressure, under threat, unpredictability, and scarcity. And while modern life has eliminated many of those physical stressors, it has introduced a new category, psychosocial adversity. This includes emotional confrontation, professional rejection, interpersonal manipulation, and chronic uncertainty. When people avoid these stressors altogether, they may feel safer in the short term, but neurologically, they become fragile. The key is not avoidance, it's strategic exposure. This concept is grounded in the science of hormesis, a biological principle stating that small doses of stress strengthen the system. Just as the immune system requires controlled exposure to pathogens to build resistance, the nervous system builds resilience through regulated, intentional contact with discomfort. This is how immunity to emotional chaos is built, not through isolation, but through deliberate training. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, HPA, axis governs your body's response to stress. When activated, it releases cortisol and adrenaline to prepare you for action. If this system is triggered too often or too intensely without regulation, it becomes dysregulated, leading to burnout, anxiety, and emotional hypersensitivity. But when activated in moderate, controlled doses, the HPAs becomes stronger. It recovers faster, it becomes more efficient at calibrating response to threat. This is what happens when you expose yourself strategically to adversity. Consider the neural benefits of cold exposure. Deliberately placing the body in a cold environment causes an acute stress response. But over time, repeated exposure teaches the nervous system that this stress is survivable. Heart rate stabilizes faster, breath control improves, cortisol peaks earlier and returns to baseline more quickly. The same principle applies to psychological stress. When you intentionally confront difficult conversations, initiate discomfort, or practice presence in emotionally intense settings, you are training your brain to remain functional under pressure. This is where the prefrontal cortex comes in. It is responsible for regulating the limbic system, the emotional brain, and is crucial for maintaining behavioral control in adversity. With repeated exposure to manageable stress, prefrontal limbic connectivity strengthens. This means you retain access to logic, planning, and long-term perspective, even when emotionally provoked. Toxic individuals often exploit emotional vulnerability. They know how to trigger reactivity. But a well-trained nervous system doesn't take the bait. It registers the stimulus, regulates internally, and responds selectively. Strategic adversity also improves dopaminergic calibration. When people overconsume comfort, constant entertainment, approval, distraction, they desensitize dopamine receptors. As a result, their motivation systems degrade. Small tasks feel overwhelming. Progress becomes exhausting. But when you restrict comfort and introduce challenge, dopamine becomes more responsive. The reward signal for completing hard things gets stronger. This is why training in adversity increases drive, momentum, and follow-through neurologically, not just emotionally. There's also a change in interoceptive accuracy. This is your brain's ability to read internal signals, hunger, fatigue, anxiety, and send in and interpret them correctly. People who avoid adversity tend to misread these signals. They feel a spike of discomfort and interpret it as danger, panic, or failure. But with strategic exposure, the brain begins to update its map. Discomfort is no longer equated with threat. It becomes data. This distinction is what separates emotionally reactive individuals from emotionally intelligent ones. Crucially, strategic adversity must be voluntary and progressive. If it's too overwhelming, it leads to trauma. If it's too mild, there's no adaptation. You need a window of challenge that is slightly above your current capacity. This could be asserting a boundary, facing a phobia, tolerating silence in a confrontation, or doing something physically demanding when your mind wants to quit. These controlled doses of discomfort create neural scaffolding adaptive circuits that become your default in unpredictable environments. Over time, this training leads to autonomic flexibility. The nervous system becomes capable of switching between sympathetic arousal and parasympathetic calm efficiently. You gain the ability to upregulate when performance is required and downregulate when rest is needed. This flexibility is the true marker of emotional immunity. It means you are no longer ruled by your environment. Whether surrounded by conflict, apathy, aggression, or instability, your internal systems remain stable and responsive, not reactive. The human brain is not wired for constant neutrality. It is wired to prioritize, to filter, and to act. Without a guiding signal, without a clearly defined purpose, it becomes vulnerable to distraction, emotional noise, and manipulation. Purpose is not just a philosophical concept, it's a neurological compass. It organizes perception, reduces cognitive load, and directs energy with precision. In the presence of toxic people, unclear motives, or emotional volatility, purpose becomes the stabilizing force that anchors your brain and body to what truly matters. At the biological level, purpose impacts the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for planning, decision-making, and impulse control. When you engage with a task or mission that aligns with a deeply held purpose, your brain enters a more efficient state of activation. Neural firing becomes organized. Attention networks are streamlined. The brain no longer wastes energy trying to determine what matters and what doesn't because that decision has already been made. This is critical in environments filled with toxic energy. Toxic individuals thrive in ambiguity. They provoke, confuse, guilt, distract. Their influence spreads in environments where goals are unclear and standards are flexible. Purpose acts as a neural filter and internal system that evaluates external information based on relevance. Without purpose, every negative interaction gets processed at full volume. With purpose, irrelevant emotional noise gets downregulated. The dopaminergic system, particularly the mesolimbic pathway, is another key player in how purpose impacts brain function. Dopamine is often misunderstood as the molecule of pleasure. In reality, it's the molecule of pursuit. When you set a meaningful goal and begin taking steps toward it, dopamine is released in anticipation of future reward. This creates momentum, motivation, and emotional stability. Purpose creates a steady stream of this pursuit-driven dopamine, which competes directly with the stress-driven cortisol released during toxic interactions. This shift has measurable psychological effects. Individuals operating with strong purpose demonstrate increased resilience to criticism, greater resistance to social comparison, and more adaptive emotional responses to adversity. The reason is neurological purpose reduces the amount of bandwidth you allocate to low-value stimuli. That passive-aggressive comment, that manipulative silence, that attempt to pull you into drama, they're not ignored out of indifference, but deprioritized by design. Your brain is engaged elsewhere. Purpose also modifies the function of the default mode network, DMNN, the system in the brain that governs introspection, self-referential thinking, and narrative construction. In idle moments, the DEM often leads to rumination, especially in individuals surrounded by emotionally destabilizing people. But when purpose is well defined, the demon becomes a space for creative ideation and self-direction rather than replaying past conflicts or anticipating future confrontations. Your inner monologue shifts from defense to design. There is also a hormonal shift. Research shows that individuals with a strong sense of purpose exhibit lower baseline cortisol levels, even in high-stress environments. Their autonomic nervous systems return to homeostasis more quickly after conflict. They are physiologically more capable of regulating emotional spikes because the body reads the stressor as less significant in comparison to the overriding mission. This creates what is often called emotional immunity, but at its core, it's biological prioritization. Purpose is not an abstract idea, it's a sensory and motor regulator. It determines what you look at, how long you look at it, and how you respond. When you have a defined purpose, your reticular activating system, RAS, the brain's attention gateway, filters incoming data accordingly. It searches the environment for opportunities, not threats. It flags solutions, not insults. This alters your stress reactivity in real time and shapes how you remember interactions after they've passed. Even at the behavioral level, purpose recalibrates action. Toxic people often get you to abandon routines, delay self-care, or compromise values. But with purpose, you act in alignment, not reaction. You wake up to execute, not defend. Your brain is no longer spending valuable energy assessing the emotional terrain of others. It is calculating steps toward an outcome that matters more than approval or control. Purpose reduces the power of toxic influence by rendering it irrelevant to your nervous system. It strips manipulative behavior of its urgency. When your life is oriented around something large or something structured, measurable, and meaningful, your perception of threats, distractions, and temptations is fundamentally altered. The noise doesn't disappear, but it no longer commands the same neurochemical priority.